And thank you everyone for joining us Saturday morning. I really want to stick to our 45-minute to an hour window just so everyone can have the rest of their Saturdays. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll let people in as they join us.
Great, thanks. So maybe Sarah and I can do quick introductions, and then the way we thought we would organize this is each of us would give kind of like an opening statement of sorts, and then can open it up for questions. So maybe about half the time us just talking about what we were thinking about ahead of time, and then half the time we can take questions from all of you. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself first. I'm Matt Notowidigo. I'm a professor of economics at University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I do research in labor economics and healthcare. And I'll be teaching next quarter a healthcare economics class to the full-time and part-time MBA students. Turn it over to Sarah.
And I'm Sarah Jacobson. I teach at Williams College. I am an environmental and behavioral economist, and what do I want to say that's relevant? Right now I'm on leave at Cornell, so I'm not at Williams, but I'm happy to be here. So Matt, do you want to give your opening thing first, or should I? Either way is good by me.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I wanted to begin by just giving like a little bit of the landscape of the conference itself before getting into our thoughts on how to use your time there effectively, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I don't know how much all of you know about the conference itself, so I thought that would be helpful background. So the ASSA Conference is an annual conference organized by the American Economic Association. It's a ton of work for the AEA president to fill it all, like put it all together. They have a lot of help with the AEA, but it's sort of one of their jobs as president of the AEA is to organize this incredibly big mammoth conference. It alternates across like 4 to 6 cities, and it's planned out like years in advance because the economists are cheapskates, and so they negotiate really good rates many years ahead of time, and they don't go to popular cities like Las Vegas. Like the AEAs will never be at Las Vegas. I think that's partly because economists don't like to gamble because they're a pretty hyper rational group, but also because they wouldn't be able to get as good of the hotel deals. So it's a gigantic conference. It's like I tried to look it up this morning. I think it's like 10 to 15,000 attendees. I'm told that it's larger number of attendees in the better weather, like because it's always held in January, usually the first week of January. And so like when San Diego, a lot of economists I think like to travel to San Diego. In Chicago or Philadelphia in the first week in January, it can be a pretty mixed bag. One year I got stuck in Philadelphia for several days after the conference because all the flights got canceled. And at one point, my colleagues and I were thinking about like renting a van and all driving back from Philadelphia to Chicago together. We decided not to do that. We just hung out in a hotel for an extra couple of days. So 10 to 15,000 people. Because of that size, like the AEA rents out a bunch of hotels. There's like the main hotel, which is where a lot of the conference sessions are. And then there's a bunch of like satellite hotels that sometimes hold additional spillover sessions, but for the most part, it's just extra hotel rooms for all the visitors. AEA negotiates pretty good discounted rates so that like faculty, staff, and students and stuff can all like basically go to the conference pretty cheaply in terms of the hotel. There's an attendance fee that you pay to go. That just helps offset AEA's costs of putting the whole thing together. I think there are two main goals in the AEA conference. The first is the AEA president, with like a big staff of conference organizers, organizes a bunch of sessions where people present their research. So I think that's one of the main goals. But then the other main goal is that it's basically the main economics job market. These days, there are actually 2 main job markets. There's one run by the AEA, and there's one run by the economic associations in Europe. I don't know what this is going to look like post-COVID, but pre-COVID, if you wanted to get a job in Europe, it was like strongly encouraged that you attend that conference as well. So basically, when students are wrapping up their PhD, in their last year before they defend their dissertation, they will typically go to the AEA conference and do all of their first round interviews for all of the jobs that they've applied to. All of the jobs that select them for first round interviews. So that often includes both academic and non-academic jobs. So the universities go there to recruit PhD students, but also non-academic organizations, both public, private sector, government will also, many of them will go there for the first round interviews. So these are like typically 30-minute interviews. You know, if you're doing really well and a lot of people want to hire you, you could spend the entire conference just going to a lot of different 30-minute interviews, which means that that year you actually don't attend much of the conference. You're just there to do interviewing. And I'm giving this as background because I was like reflecting on my own experience as a grad student. And, you know, that job that year when I was like my last year, I went to the conference, but I didn't attend a single session. It was like the 2 previous years when I went as an attendee because I wasn't interviewing for jobs at that point. I was just there to see the presentations. So again, one of the goals of the conference is to organize basically this very centralized job market. It's always been interesting to me just like how centralized this process is. Like economists, you know, sometimes like to think about the free market and just letting everyone do what they want, but like that's definitely not what it's like here. It's organized with the goal of centralizing the interviewing process in a way that, you know, hopefully is good for both the organizations hiring and the students. If I want to go back to the other goal of the conference, which is the presentation part where people get to present their research. So here, the AEAs, it's a little bit different than other conferences that I go to and seminars or workshops you might see at universities. Because it's such a big conference and so many people want to present, like the whole thing is gigantic. There's lots of parallel sessions all happening at the same time. And I think that puts a fair amount of time pressure on the whole ordeal. And so when you do get the opportunity to present at the ASA, you typically don't present for very long. You typically get maybe 12 to 15, maybe 20 minutes to present your research. You know, it's a great privilege to get to present because it's this gigantic conference, and typical sessions have anywhere from 30 to 50 or even over 100 people attending. So it is a great way for people to learn about what you're working on. But you can't go into a lot of depth about what you've done in your research because, again, you only have like 12 to 15, maybe 20 minutes. The typical presentations I would give at universities or at other conferences, I often get like an hour and 15 minutes or even an hour and a half. So you can go through your original research in just a lot more detail. So that's a very, I think it's very difficult to navigate. Like I presented only a handful of times, but I find it very unusual because I'm not used to presenting my research in that compressed of a time window. The sessions are typically 2 hours long, and they have 3 to 4 presentations organized around sometimes a pretty specific topic. Like last year, one of the sessions I attended was on evictions. And sometimes it's a much broader topic. Like a couple of years ago, I went to a session on Native American, like economic outcomes of Native Americans. So just very, very broad because that could encompass a lot of things. It's all up to the organizer. So what the organizers do is they come up with a session that they propose to the AEA that includes a set of papers united under some common theme. And then the AEA committee that organizes the conference decides whether or not to include that session. And it's pretty selective. Like I think I applied 3 times this year and I was 0 for 3. So I will not be presenting at the AEAs this year. Again, 3 to 4 presentations. And sometimes after the presenter talks about their research, then there's a discussant who's read the paper ahead of time and they have like a 8 to 10 or 12-minute discussion afterwards. So when you see the conference schedule, you're going to see like a bunch of different parallel sessions in a bunch of different areas. And when I was a student, sort of the way that I navigated this is I just looked for topics or areas or researchers that I thought were interesting, and I get to see them talk about their work for 20 or 30 minutes. So like thinking back to my time in grad school, like one of the economists who kind of inspired me to go to grad school in the first place was Steve Levitt, the Chicago economist who wrote Freakonomics. I remember in grad school when he was doing one of the sessions, I decided just to go to that session because I wanted to see him present. I wanted to see what he was working on right now. I also, because of my research interests in healthcare and labor markets, I would always look for a handful of sessions that were either in healthcare or labor. So I can talk a little bit more about how I think you should navigate it, but I want to turn it over to Sarah now to just give maybe a little bit more of her opening statement, and then we can continue the conversation. But hopefully that gives you a good landscape of like how the conference is organized and what it's all about. There's a question in the chat about whether undergrads present at the conference. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens every once in a while, but given what I just said about how selective the conference is, my guess is it's pretty unusual. I think it's also pretty unusual even for graduate students to be presenting in the conference. The grad students that I advise at Chicago and the ones I advise at Northwestern, they seem to always be itching to present at conferences, which I understand that impulse because they want to get feedback on their research. But I think it's very hard to get into the AEA conference. And so I was often telling them that that's not really the right place to start. Relative to when I was a grad student, there are many more student-run conferences run sort of by PhD students for PhD students. So there's a really great one that I've been really proud to be a part of that's jointly organized by Northwestern and UChicago. And they get a ton of submissions from grad students. It's a great way for grad students to meet other grad students and present to each other and get feedback. And so, that's like an example of where you could start with that and then move on to other conferences as you move along. So I'll go ahead and pause there, turn it over to Sarah, and then we can continue the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. And I agree with everything Matt said. On the undergraduates, I guess I'll use that question as a segue to thinking more broadly about conferences, and then zoom back to ASSA in a minute. But first, I'll give my best possible answer to Charlie's question about whether interviews are likely to be virtual only going forward. And I'll just be honest, I have no idea. I don't think anybody knows what the equilibrium is going to be. There's been a lot of talk as an environmental economist, there's been a lot of talk in environmental economics, as you might expect, for many years about why are we flying to conferences, right? It's like, it's not really great for the environment. And whether we could have virtual conferences. In the last 2 years of having virtual conferences has raised the question of going forward, should we have some virtual conferences? And as I'll go into more in a minute, virtual conferences kind of suck, but we'll talk a little bit about how to get the most out of them. But I think there is a question about going forward whether we should have hybrid conferences to allow more people to attend remotely who wouldn't be able to attend otherwise at all. And so I think that we just don't know whether people will start to feel more comfortable with these things and whether the technology will come to be transparent to where people feel like it serves the purpose as well, or almost as well as being in person. So I'll just start by saying, I think more broadly, I think the purpose of conferences, well, there are multiple purposes, but I think the general, I would say 2 main things are that academic life can be incredibly isolating. You may be one of the only people who does sort of what you do at your institution. And building a network within your profession becomes really important. And then the second purpose, I think, sort of relates to that. So the first, I'm talking more about sort of emotionally, you need to have your network, but professionally, you need to have your network. You need to be sharing your work. You need to be absorbing other new work. And where, most of you are at in your growth as a scholar, you probably don't have much of the kind of work that we tend to share at conferences. And I would say, Matt is totally right, that I think very few conferences are in economics are set up to have an undergraduate section. In other fields, undergraduates and grad students presenting is very common. And in fact, you'll often have a poster session that might be very specific to undergraduates, and grad students might be a big presence. At other conferences in economics, grad students can be a big presence, but undergraduates are less of a thing. And I think that that's a shortcoming. I think that that's something that we should change in economics, because I think it's something that would make economics more engaging if we brought undergraduates to conferences more. So not saying it's a good thing, but descriptively, undergraduates rarely attend these big conferences. But I do think that there is a lot that can be gotten from these conferences. ASSA, though, I will say, is my least favorite conference. And so I think a lot of us only go to ASSA when we have to. And a lot of us, when we go to ASSA, we go to very few conference presentation sessions. So we go there either because we have to do something on the job market, on one side or the other, or we have to attend a business meeting, a professional association, or we are looking forward to meeting up with co-authors and friends from grad school and stuff like that. So I would say, one piece that I would put out there is take advantage of any conference that you're going to engage with. as a way to deepen and build networks, and don't feel obliged to go to all, fill in paper sessions in all of the times. It's different for a virtual conference, but when you go to a conference that's in person, spend time hanging out in the hotel lobby, bump into people, chat with people as much as you can. There is a whole conference anxiety thing, and I'm not going to lie about that. If you have any kind of social anxiety, conferences are going to amp that up, because what's going on, you, especially early in your career, you are going into a room, you don't really know a lot of people. There may be some people who are really fancy, and guess what? A lot of us have imposter syndrome. And so you go into this room and you kind of, you look around and you see these fancy people, and other people seem to know each other because they've been coming to this conference for longer, and it can feel really intimidating. But the way that they got to know each other was by taking those steps to go up to each other. And so, at a virtual conference, there will be some virtual networking sessions, and I encourage you to take advantage of those. They're in slightly awkward platforms. Typically, you might have an avatar who's walking around a virtual world or whatever. They might be Zoom breakout rooms, but I think take advantage of these opportunities and get to know people, and I think one of the things about networking is you're not necessarily just trying to network up, right? Like, nobody wants to be that person who, looks at the name tag and says, oh, you're not an institution that's fancy enough for me to want to talk to you, and so walks away. Like, that's not cool. Building networks is important, whether you are building networks with a fancy University of Chicago labor economist, or whether you're building it with another student like yourself. That person might be somebody that you are friends with for the rest of your career and that you co-author with. So I think taking those opportunities is very important. Let's see. A couple other comments that I want to make before I hand it off. So I said that ASSA is my least favorite conference. There are a lot of other conferences out there, and a lot of them are more structured around sort of inclusion, professional development, and building people up. And so I like small to medium-sized conferences. There are also some really small workshops. And so I would say, as you're coming up, look for conferences like that. Those conferences might be, that's right. So those conferences might be providing some really great opportunities for you. And so I would say, look for those as ways to get to know people. Because building those networks is super important. Let's see. Another comment that I wanted to make is about in the virtual format. I think staying focused, like going to conference, the presentation sessions, I think is worthwhile, just not too many of them. And in the virtual world, staying focused is really hard. Actually, even in person, staying focused is really hard. So I have little tricks for myself of maybe taking notes or live tweeting. I don't suggest taking photos if you're going to live tweet, but live tweeting is kind of a nice way, if you're on Twitter, to sort of, you're providing a service to others, you're keeping yourself engaged. So I think that there's good things about that. Another sort of tip and trick that I've heard with regard to receptions and conferences in general is if you're a person that has any kind of conference anxiety, social anxiety, make plans in advance. So if you look through the program and you see, oh, Matt Notowidigo is presenting in this session, and I really like his work, send him an email in advance and say, let's get coffee. Do you have time? Some of these people aren't going to respond, but like emails like this out of the blue are totally normal. And it's a good way to build some structure to something that can be a little anxiety giving. The only other thing I'll do is I'll just respond to the comment about moving between sessions. So it's conference sessions, each, as Matt says, have 3 or 4 papers in them. And everybody knows that you're supposed to present the papers in the order on the program to let people move between sessions. It's totally expected, totally normal, whether it's in person or virtual. And so, feel free if you see that you like the first two papers in this session and then the last two papers in that session, just hop from one to the other. It's completely normal. Try not to knock anything over if it's an in-person. Totally a normal thing to do. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Matt, go ahead.
So that was great. It's totally normal and expected. I mean, it doesn't always line up because, some session chairs are better at enforcing time than others. But, if you're off by a couple of minutes, it's totally understood and wouldn't be viewed weirdly. I think we're basically ready to open it up to questions. I just wanted to emphasize on the networking element, like emailing people proactively. Sometimes I feel too shy to do that, but I've been always surprised at the yield, specifically at conferences. The hypothesis I have is that I'm really busy during the week, like when I'm at my job normally, but at conferences, there's more dead time. And so if you get emails from people, that have thoughtfully taken the time to explain why it would be useful to meet with you, I'm this is sort of pre-virtual conference, I'm away from my family for a couple of days. I'm otherwise be bored in my hotel room. It's just a great time to actually go and meet new people. And so I think that's one great way. You have to sort of put yourself out there a little bit, but it can be a great way to meet people. I've actually found that that's often a great way to get feedback on my work, because then it's sort of, you have this focused 30-minute conversation with someone who's very close to my field. The other way that I've met people is that the AEA has in the schedule built in. So, during most of the day, there are these parallel sessions, but there's also a lot of organized receptions from a bunch of different organizations, universities, nonprofits, private sector firms. They're pretty casual, informal receptions. There's free food, absolutely. I don't think the food is the big amenity because it's usually hotel food. But I guess you're students, so any type of free food maybe is a pull. Sometimes free alcohol, I guess. Then you get carded. But anyway, they're informal, casual. I think that's a good way to meet people as well. I think they're usually either mid to late afternoon or at the end of the day. And again, the Williams would have one, MIT, where I went to grad school, would have one. I really liked what Sarah said about the emotional aspect of conferences, because I also feel like academia can be very lonely and solitary sometimes. And, what's something I've really missed about the virtual conference environment is that something I did look forward to at the AEAs was actually meeting the students that I went to grad school with and just seeing what they're up to. And even though they end up doing very different types of research, often that's a very good network too, because since we all overlapped, we're kind of at the same point in our careers and life cycles, and we're kind of dealing with a lot of the same things. And so just reconnecting with them. And then sometimes crashing these other events at other universities to meet alums from other schools is a strategy I've done. Again, not primarily for the free food, but just to meet other people. So anyway, I want to use the rest of our time to just hear from all of you about anything else that you're thinking about or answer questions that would be most useful to all of you.
I just want to piggyback and say two things. So I think that talking to people who are doing things similar to you, I think, is one great thing about conferences, but talking to people who are doing things different from you, like Matt was saying about grad school buddies, totally a wonderful thing about conferences. And in fact, one thing that I sometimes do at conferences is I go to sessions that are, environmental behavioral things close to what I do, but then I try to find something that's sounds cool, but I don't do it at all. And then I might learn something totally new and totally different. And that's really cool. Another good way to pick sessions, especially at something like ASSA, as was noted in the chat, SIMGIP has some sessions. A bunch of the associations have sessions. And so they might be affiliation, like identity type affiliation associations like SIMGIP, NEA, the National Economic Association, ASH, the Hispanic Economists Association, or they might be thematic like ARI, the Environmental Economics, ESA, the Experimental Economics. And those can, be one way of filtering. It's also the only way I've ever presented is through association sessions like that. And it can be like a little bit of a sub-conference within a conference. But yes, Matt is right. We should open it up to questions. I think that, are there any questions from the chat that we haven't addressed yet, Matt? Let me see.
I'm just going to chime in while you all are taking a look at that. Cecilia Conrad told us when we were graduate students to go before you were on the job market, because the year that you're on the job market, it is absolutely crazy. You're spending most of your time going to meetings. So unlike Matt and Sarah, I think I have been every year since 1996, except for 2. And both of those years I didn't go because there were deaths in the family. But
I've been every year too. I to be totally candid, I have a similar view to Sarah, but like I go because partly I have to. I mean, I'm trying to interview people every year. And so some of my time at the conference is spent interviewing people that I'm trying to hire, either at Chicago or when I was at Northwestern, it was the same thing. So the way I organize my time at the conference is like when I'm not scheduled to be interviewing people, I either look to see if there's a session I'm interested in attending, or if someone's emailed me to meet, I do that, and then I pick my favorite receptions to go to at the end of each day. I think also recently I've tried to go to there's also some events like celebrating people, and I've been increasingly trying to go. I didn't go to that early on, but I've been finding it to be pretty uplifting to like, so these are like the people that win awards, either very prestigious awards like Distinguished Fellows or the John Bates Clark Medal, but also like the AEA does best paper prizes for the best paper published in each of the American economic journals. And these typically it's like usually like a short presentation, maybe a short speech, and then another reception, more free food, in many cases. And I think it's like, I've just found that it sort of raises my spirits to like hear about the best kind of work that's going on from different people. And those are also, on the schedule, typically at the end of the day. So it's not overlapping with presentations, but might be overlapping with some of the other receptions.
So there are some other things as well that I think can be good. So on that note, I think keynotes sometimes are hit or miss. I've gone to some keynotes and I've been like, that was not a good use of my time. But then I've gone to some keynotes where I've been like, whoa, that's amazing. So I think look at the schedule for those kinds of things. Also, I'd say there are some things related to associations like SIMGIP and CSWEP and other things like that that can be really positive. So in some cases, it's like a separate, what do I want to say? So in some cases they will have a business meeting. Those are usually kind of boring, but they can be sometimes good ways to get to know people. But in some cases, there are some other kinds of spaces that are left. So for example, CSWEP, which is the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economic Profession, has a lot of structures that they set up at the ASSA conference. They have a support room throughout the day, and then they have these breakfast mentoring sessions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know, Matt, are you doing the breakfast mentoring this year?
Yeah, I've done that the last several years. This is I guess pre-COVID, this was like an in-person breakfast where you would circulate between tables and have kind of like rapid fire mentoring type questions about how to navigate the profession in different ways. And I really enjoyed doing that. And I think that it was typically targeted towards assistant professors, I believe.
Yeah, then they created one for mid-career folks also.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, the main thing is for assistant professor folks. So yeah, so depending on where you are in your career, but I think some of these things a lot of these things are less exclusive than they might look like they are. And so I think a lot of these things, I mean, just look at them and see if there's anything that bars you from attending, but most likely some of these professional development opportunities are things that you are quite welcome at.
Yeah, I think in terms of the presentations when I was a grad student, like I I don't think I was using it mostly to figure out what I wanted to work on, because I feel like at my university, we had visitors coming in, and I was taking, classes in my first and second year to sort of sort out my own research interests. I think the thing that was pretty memorable to me when I went as a grad student was just I could see how people presented, see how people discussed papers, see how people thought about the questions they were getting and how they answered questions. And I think there's a certain hidden curriculum there of just, what constitutes an effective presentation versus what's something where people listen to it for 30 minutes and have no idea what's going on. And so I think that's a skill that takes practice, and just seeing how people, like, seeing some really clear presentations and really clear discussions, and really, people doing a great job answering questions. Because often, I guess I didn't mention this, but oftentimes after the presentation discussion, then they open it up to the full set of people attending the session to ask questions. And I just think that I learned a lot from just paying attention to that, and learning, trying to learn about how to be a better presenter. Is there something in the chat about the exhibit hall? Yeah, there's books and free swag. Yeah, that's great, man. That really does take me back to grad school. Yeah, that's good. I guess some of the exhibit halls also include the conference posters. I remember actually, spending time in grad school there as well, because sometimes, probably the case that's disproportionately graduate students. That is to say, like, grad students are more likely to be invited to give a conference poster rather than present in a session. So maybe there's good opportunities there to meet grad students that are doing similar work. I'd say in grad school, I would typically peruse through the conference hall to see all the posters. It's definitely worth spending time in the exhibit hall to get free stuff. Happy to do that as well. Sometimes those are organizations. Sometimes the free swag are companies that regularly recruit economics students. And so there's a kind of networking built into the free swag, which is these are places that would really like to tell you about what it is they do and why it should be on your radar. And Amazon is a unusual example, because Amazon hires billions of economists to a first approximation. But a lot of these other organizations actually find it hard to get on economic students' radar, but the jobs are really fun and interesting. And so there's actually a good amount of information there that you could learn from those companies of what they do while they're giving you free stuff. So definitely recommend that.
In a bunch of the stuff in the exhibitors hall is more focused on teaching, so it might be textbooks and stuff like that. But also, I remember SysQueep, which I don't remember what all the letters stand for, but it's the LGBTQ focused one. They were giving out pronoun stickers and other nice stuff like that. So you find some good things there as well.
I'm going to chime in, but you can say in the exhibit hall, there are also, just like the books that we just sent you off of the summer, you can find those kind of books, and they're usually discounted 20%, 15%, whatever the case may be. And they'll ship for free, or sometimes on the last day, if there are books that are still there, I always have extra space in my suitcase because I want to,
man, that's awesome,
day, get the real discount on the books that I want, but then you've got to be able to bring them home. And yeah, I love the exhibit hall. I'm all for the swag and the people who have the best candy, rate really high for
collecting coffee mugs. That's awesome.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Okay. Questions?
Yeah, I'd like to hear from any of you if there's anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like us to discuss. Or you can put it into the chat. So far we've been talking mostly about the ASSA meetings, but I think a lot of the things we're talking about apply to other conferences as well. As Sarah mentioned, when I was a grad student, I also went to since I'm a labor economist, I went to the Society of Labor Economics annual meeting. And that for me was I think that was probably even more effective from a networking perspective, because it was pre-screened, self-selected set of labor economists. And also I had early in my career, I had a much better hit rate in terms of getting my papers into that conference. But I think, presenting at conferences it's I think early in my career, I thought it was like mostly about getting feedback. And I actually think it's more about visibility. It's about like people learning and seeing what it is that you do and who you are. And my senior colleague, Eric Hurst, who's I guess for many years been something of a mentor to me, he would call it like advertising my brand. That this is who I am and what I do, and I'm just explaining that. So it's not about feedback, because in his mind, and I think this is right, is that you need a closer relationship with people for them to really engage with your work and give feedback. So that for me, that's been mentors, but also like classmates, like just, or people kind of roughly at my same age and stage in the career. It's like we sort of have this reciprocal arrangement where, I send them my work and they send me their work, and we read it and give comments, and that's often even more effective than the conferences. In addition to like the field specific conferences, there's also regional conferences. So not like the American Economic Association draws from economists all around the country. There are also regional conferences like the Southern Economic Association, Midwest Economic Association. I'm probably not going to remember all the regions.
There's Easterns, which is right now having theirs in Jamaica this month.
Yeah, and those I think have a lot of the same features that we've been talking about.
I would say Southerns is the big one of those, and Southerns is kind of a huge conference, but nevertheless, I actually somehow I know a lot of people there. I feel like when I go to ASSA, it's like huge. I feel like when I go to Southerns, like I know a lot of people. It's kind of, it can be cozy. I think that the subject matter focused conferences are my preferred conferences though. And some of the best conferences, especially when you're in grad school, are these small things. They're often called workshops instead of conferences. They might be what's called single track, which means that you don't have parallel sessions going on. And so everybody stays in the same room all the time. And that's just a great way to get to know people. And I agree with Matt that it's typically less about providing and getting feedback on a specific paper. But you never know, it's like part of the benefit of conferences, honestly, is the deadline for yourself in getting yourself to put together your results for something. But sometimes you share something in a conference session and somebody says something, you're like, oh, that's something that I should do. Go ahead, Charlene.
I was wondering if policymakers pay attention to what's going on the conferences, especially this one.
The AEA has done a better job, I would say, of like helping media, journalists and policy people pay attention to what's going on. I think some conferences do more of this than others. So like Brookings runs conferences where they actually go out of their way to invite both like economics writers in the media and policy types to the conference, and really sort of nudge them to sit there and listen. So I think it can happen. In my experience, that I guess I perceive there to be somewhat of an upward trend on this, that I feel like the media at least is covering some sessions in the conference more than they used to. So I think there's pros and cons there. It's sort of like, you might speak a little more freely if you didn't think the press was listening, and so it's probably there's probably pros and cons from this.
Yeah, and I would say the media will be maybe at some of the big professional development sessions. So for example, I think we didn't mention this. There can be some professional development sessions which can be quite good, that might be giving advice about a variety of things. So I've been in sessions that are about using social media to get out into the world, that are about just different things about advancing your career. And some of these things, the media right now is very interested in something a lot of us are interested in, which is inclusion in economics. And so, the media has been showing up at those kinds of sessions as well. So I think that is a thing. And I don't know that I've seen policymakers other than economists who are in policy at the conference, but they certainly are consuming it through the media.
Yeah, I would say like specifically for on the policymaker side, I think the conferences that I've attended where I really felt like policymakers were listening were ones where that was in the minds of the organizers from the beginning. Not, I don't think it's something that typically like happens organically at the AEA. So, and it's like, typically takes like the organizers thinking about what are going to be the kinds of presentations that like academics could give that policymakers would actually want to listen to and get something useful out of. Like I'm really impressed with like the feds, for example. They do a great job organizing conferences where they bring in both researchers and people in the policy community, collide them together and make them spend half a day or a day together. But they really have to be thinking about it from the beginning, if that makes sense.
Can I ask another question?
Sure, go ahead.
Please.
Sorry. So, in terms of social media and like networking, do you think it's better for people like us in our early career to be more active on LinkedIn or like Twitter? Because I think I just have like a fear of the paper trail of like whatever opinion to have.
So I'm big on Twitter, not in the sense of like being popular on Twitter, but in the sense of spending more time on Twitter than I should. And I actually think econ Twitter is a nice place. You can curate it so that you are surrounded by nice people. And I think a lot of econ Twitter is people who are interested in making economics better. And so I think that that part of social media, I think, is a great place to make connections with people. And there's a lot of people out there who want to amplify you and your work. So I would say econ Twitter, I strongly endorse that. I don't know that much about LinkedIn. As far as I know, most PhD economists aren't spending a lot of time on LinkedIn unless they are doing private sector work or trying to keep up with students who are graduated, who are in the private sector. So, and I wouldn't worry that much about paper trail. I mean, obviously, like there's a whole bunch of things that you could post on social media that would be problematic for like whatever you do going forward. So don't post those things. But like, I think like most of what I post on Twitter is not about economics, and I still have a job. So I don't know if that's survivorship bias, but like it's worked out okay for me.
I agree with all of that. I think it is a really nice, friendly community. I think the main thing that I get out of initially, the main thing I got out of econ Twitter was actually just exposing me to other people's research that I otherwise wouldn't have come across. And so I think for like advising, when I'm advising students, I typically tell them to like at least pay attention to it a little bit, because you might be surprised by what you find. It's almost like the community does a good job like building attention to papers that maybe are a little bit under the radar, or not written by people that otherwise would get a lot of attention to their papers. And I just think as a researcher, it's like great for me to get exposed to that work, many years earlier than I otherwise would, because our publication lags are so ridiculously long and slow that like I wouldn't see the paper in a journal for 3 or 4 years. But then seeing like I've come across really great papers. It happens like at least a couple times a month that I think I otherwise wouldn't have seen. And that's what keeps me at least paying a little bit of attention to it. I think it does take some self-control, both in terms of like not, what Sarah's saying, like, using it more than I should. I do have that feeling from time to time. And so now I have all these like website blockers where, from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. it's like I go to twitter.com and I'm blocked on it. But that's because I need it. Otherwise, I'm too tempted to check it all the time. Because it's subject to the like, habit formation aspect or the addicted goods nature aspect to it. I think it's a really positive place. Michelle, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your tips and tricks, because for some of us, like hearing this might be the first time. For me, I picked out a lot of things that you guys had said and I learned a lot, so I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask, and this is in relation to just having like everything virtual, or for the most part. So what I've seen is right in the beginning when we had virtual type conferences, it was on platforms like Zoom where you could see everyone and actively see if people are engaged. But a lot of conferences that I've gone to recently have all been like on WebEx or something like that, where we just sit back and you can't see the people who are in the room, or it's a Zoom where you can only see the panelists. So from a grad student perspective, if we see a presenter that, we find their research really, interesting, what would be the most effective way to reach out to that individual when it's not directly within that like conference time and like in front of everyone? So I guess if you were presenting and a student were to reach out to you, what methods do you think would be the best and most effective?
I think everybody loves an email that says, "I love your work. That was really cool." Like, so you're never going to offend somebody by emailing them and saying like, "That was really cool." At an in-person conference, you could go up to them afterwards and say that, or if you see them like in a hallway or something. But I think that email, I think, is good. And I think it's exactly right that you can also send a message on Twitter. You can either tweet about their presentation, say, "Oh, this presentation that I saw on, wildfires and mortality was so amazing," and like tag the person. Not everybody's DMs are open, so you might not be able to message them. But in terms of like a direct conversation, I would say email is pretty reliable. What do you think, Matt?
It's a great question, and I guess I'm just hoping that this virtual world is not the new normal, because I think, thinking about myself, if I give a virtual presentation and then get an email right after it, like once I've given the virtual presentation, I'm sort of like back to doing what I'm doing. Like then I'm pretty busy and maybe not as attentive. But at a con, like what I was trying to say about the in-person conference is just, I feel like I have so much more free time to engage with people I don't know. And so I think it's worth trying, but I don't know if it would be quite as effective. I think that just shows that like in this virtual universe, we might need to come up with other strategies. Like I think that the virtual avatars that Sarah was talking about, like I think that's great. Like, because I would be happy to spend an hour with my virtual avatar, like going around and meeting people, and maybe that, and then people, if they've seen my presentation and want to meet me, maybe that would work. But I think like the thing that I'm nervous about is just in the virtual universe, like, I mean, if I get emails, I get lots of emails. That's like hard. It's hard to like sort it all out. And I think that's why I'm looking forward to eventually returning to in-person conferences. I'm privileged enough to be part of the NBER, which also runs a lot of conferences. I think that they're planning to go back in person, or they've been like gradually moving back to being in person. I think the AEA was just proceeding a little bit more cautiously. But I would be surprised if like the AEA feels like it's going to be, virtual only for a while. I think that's pretty unlikely. I also feel like I've talked to enough people at a lot of different schools that like we're sort of all itching to see people again. Because this job is lonely and solitary. Not like I really like doing my research and I like my job overall, but like it can be really lonely and solitary. And I'm glad that Sarah mentioned that earlier. So I'm looking forward to seeing more people. And I'm starting to get invitations to visit universities again in person. Actually, at University of Chicago, we had 10 outside speakers in the microeconomics group at Booth this quarter, and 8 out of the 10 were in person. We gave them all the option. Like we let them, do a hybrid presentation where they could Zoom in and we would be there we would be there in the classroom, or they could come fly and visit, and 8 out of the 10 decided to visit.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on 2 things onto the end of that. So thing one is that some people will leave at some conferences. They're leaving the Zoom room open after the session is over so that people can chat. So if you're interested, like be attentive that might be a thing. Though it is still not quite the same. And I think the other thing is that, I think that going forward, many conferences may have virtual options, even if they have an in-person component. And I think that for people early in their careers, even though it's more expensive and burdensome to go, and it might be intimidating to go, it's really good for you to have these serendipitous encounters and be able to really physically meet with people to build those networks. So I would encourage you, even going forward, even if you have a virtual option, try to go in person if you can. and get yourself out there with the other people. Don't just be in your hotel room the whole time.
Yeah, and I mean, it's tough because like we all have lots of constraints. When I had young children, like it was often tough to force myself to travel every once in a while. But you know, I think that there are a lot of positives to doing it, subject to the environmental externality. But I did try. I think I'm looking back, like I'm happy that as an assistant professor, I really tried to force myself to make time to travel to conferences when I could do it.
Another thing that I'll say is that when you're in grad school, so I went to Georgia State University for my PhD. It's not a high ranked school. At the time, it was ranked below 100 in the rankings. And when you are coming out of a lower ranked place, then you have to work harder to get your brand out there, to use Matt's earlier phrase. You have to get yourself, get your signal out there above the noise a little bit, because the name of your institution won't speak on your behalf. And so, so even if you are coming from a place that is less well known, especially if you're coming from a place that's less well known, that's all the more reason while you're in grad school in your 3rd and 4th year, get yourself out to conferences. Even if you're not presenting, it's great if you can present, but get yourself out to conferences and start meeting people.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Matt. That was so informative and helpful. And thank you to everyone that came this morning. I want to say that if you're interested in going to any of the other conferences that were mentioned, or even workshops, reach out, because we can help you go and we can make that work. If anybody has any questions that weren't addressed today, we have our Slack channels you can utilize to reach out to Sarah and Matt or Charlie. Oh, and yes, feel free to email us, Sarah put in the chat. And to all of the mentees that attended, I'm going to reach out shortly, probably by early next week, with information to help you get registered for the conference and a short survey. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us this morning. And yeah, not to rush everyone, but just for the sake of time.
Everyone have a good weekend. Thanks, Matt and Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing. If you're done recording, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes.